Good evening, everyone. My name is Sunil Mitra Kumar, and on behalf of the King's India Institute and the Royal Anthropological Institute, it is my immense pleasure to welcome you this evening to this, the N. Srinivas Memorial Lecture. A fuller introduction to our speaker will be provided by my colleague Kriti in just a moment. I wanted to say, however, two things before that. Well, three. I guess I should say that if there's a fire alarm, it's not a joke and we need to exit. Our speaker this evening, Professor Surinder Jodka, is one of the preeminent scholars of caste of our time. And by preeminent, I mean those scholars, and I'll say a little bit more in one moment, who can be counted on the fingers of one hand, even if there's sort of been a couple of unfortunate accidents involving one or two digits. And what I mean by that is he's able to combine two very rare things. Understand caste at very micro scale, qualitatively through observation, rural, peri-urban and urban life to see how it shapes and runs and underpins society and economy and polity. And so far so good. And also theorize things such as this very difficult to pin down creature in the Indian context, class, and sort of rightly critique definitions which are reductive, which try to turn it just into an income-based measure. So on the one hand there's that. But on the second hand then, to be able to take those insights and to see how exactly do they extrapolate, to be able to collect primary data at scale through surveys, and in that sense, taste and smell it out like an economist. And in so doing, be able to combine those things, those two things. That's what makes his work very valuable and very rare. And last evening when we met, I sort of tried to co-opt / accuse him of being an economist, because as an economist it feels good that this is what the discipline can look like. And rightly or wrongly, regrettably, I was told that you do not count yourself in that fold. So that's sort of part one. And part two, of course, is that we're here to reinterpret M.N. Srinivas's work. This is work which was published half a century ago. This is work which continues to underpin, more than underpin, perhaps provide some of the leading concepts of caste, whose relevance has only grown decade on decade, and whose relevance has spread way beyond, far beyond his own original discipline. So it was published half a century ago, the data was collected 60 to 70 years ago, in a very different country, in a country whose concept of itself, nationhood, ambitions around secularism, around democracy, relative to what we have today, the links between those two visions and versions seem quite tenuous. So it's only right that we need somebody who is a preeminent scholar of caste today to be able to reinterpret for us how exactly to make sense of the things that M.N. Srinivas was saying in what seems today to be a somewhat foreign land. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Kriti to provide a less rambling and more focused introduction to our speaker.
Written notes. Thanks. Good evening, everyone, and it's really my great privilege to introduce this year's speaker, Professor Surinder Jodka, because it's not often that I have had the opportunity to introduce anyone whom I've known for over 4 decades in an academic context. I first met Professor Jodka when he was a PhD student in Chandigarh at a reading group where we both were regulars. So to introduce him today as this year's M.N. Srinivas lecturer is therefore all the more special. Until recently, Professor Jodka was the head of the Center for the Study of Social Systems, also my alma mater, and Professor of Sociology at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He received his PhD in Sociology from Punjab University, Chandigarh, and has previously taught at SG University Surat, University of Hyderabad, Central University Hyderabad, and held several visiting professorships in India and overseas. In a distinguished career spanning over 3 decades, Professor Jodka has worked, as Sunil just reminded us, extensively on caste, class, religion, and rural life, and its agrarian economy. I mean, all the big things that make up Indian society. He is the author of several books, including Caste in Contemporary India and The Indian Village, numerous co-edited books and journal articles. He is the recipient of the ICSSR Amartya Sen Prize for Distinguished Social Scientists in 2012 and the Malcolm Adeseshaya Award for Contribution to Development Studies in 2024. Now, many of us in this room have learned much from Professor Jodka's work on caste and especially on Dalit politics and economy. His work on Dalit entrepreneurs broke the mold and shaped the inquiry into contemporary Dalit communities. Similarly, his meticulous empirical work, also hinted at by Cyril, on Sikh Dalits and untouchability in rural Punjab dispelled long-held assumptions about everyday village life in the region. More recently, his work on caste in India's corporate sector does something quite similar. So if caste is seen as the uniquely Indian social formation, then the village is its authentic location. At the turn is seen as its authentic location. At the turn of this century, the historian Royal Anthropological showed us the genealogy of these and other such baselines for colonial rulers in his book, Imagining India. Professor Jodka's work on rural India has offered new insights into India's diverse economy and politics. Based on rigorous long-term field research, among other things, his work has shown the blurred boundary between sociology and anthropology, much like M.N. Srinivas, in whose honor we hold this lecture every year. And we have a previous M.N. Srinivas speaker amongst us. We are very fortunate. The power of anthropology lies in the fact that not only anthropologists, but also their texts are active agents in the world they describe, enlivening action in particular ways. M.N. Srinivas's own work is testimony to the fact of how his key concepts of social change and local power dynamics have gained agency of their own. Think the word vote bank. This evening, Professor Jodka shares his ideas on the agentive force of anthropology in relation to rural India, and unlike Indian, not for non-Indian Indians or its colonial rulers, but for Indians themselves. I now invite Professor Jodka to deliver the 2026 M.N. Srinivas lecture entitled Reading Rampura, The Remembered Village in the Time of Hindutva, Social Anthropology and the Making of the Indian Common Sense. Welcome, sir.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I'm obviously feeling extremely honored and almost convinced that I must have done something worthwhile. One is never convinced about that. Thank you so much, Kriti. Thank you so much, Kiran, for introducing me. I'm genuinely feeling nervous, almost intimidated, seeing all these luminaries who know perhaps 20 times more than I do, certainly about M.N. Srinivas and his work. And after when I was going through my slides, I've written a paper which I've given to Kriti, looking at my slides, and I was just wondering whether I have anything worthwhile to say. So that is a difficult question to answer. I hope I have something interesting to say. Thank you very much for coming and giving me this feeling that I do have some scholarship to share. When I got this invitation, I thought about what should I do. And I didn't want to present my work, which is already published or which I've been talking about. I thought I must do something different. And since it was about M.N. Srinivas, and this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, I thought, why don't I try this? And I read it without reading anything else. So the other people who have written on M.N. Srinivas, I decided not to read them first and straight away go into M.N. Srinivas, and it was quite an engaging text and quite an engaging, what one should say, last 6 weeks, 7 weeks that I've been working on it. And it helped me bring in my earlier ideas and try to then make a story. The context of this, when I prepared this abstract, I was reasonably happy with the title because it seemed something quote unquote new. But there was also other things, and that is the times in which we are living. I mean, these are not really easy times to be in a city like Delhi, perhaps also in this world. And all of us, our assumptions about our professions, our lives, our futures are kind of under doubt. We don't really know whether these disciplines will survive or not. We don't know whether our universities will survive or not. If you have worked in JNU, I think these anxieties become much bigger. So I think this context becomes very critical, and obviously the starting point has to be what we have come to call as the idea of India. And India that we used to talk about all over the world, particularly people who were South Asianists, used to easily, frequently invoke this idea of diversity, idea of its plurality. I remember long time back, I think some 25 years back, I was here in Oxford and there was some discussion happening somewhere in London. And Professor T.N. Madan was talking about tolerance, and I always thought tolerance was a very irritating word, but at least it was invoked, right? And that was seen with a lot of kind of, sincerity and commitment. So, and these were also seen as kind of realities of India which would not allow the Hindu right wing to come to center stage of Indian life as it has done. And everyone, invariably people would say, no, don't worry, diversity will take care of it. So it's not merely a kind of political process, and there is also some underlying reality or underlying realities which in some sense come together in the present moment. And there is something called majoritarian process of self-imagination, and this in some sense produces a kind of what I call as a hegemonic common sense, and this is something on which I plan to work. I mean, Indian common sense is something that people have not really been talking about. I have kind of proposed it, and I think there is a lot to unfold there. As we all know, common sense is not something which is kind of common in a conceptual sense of the term also. It also has its own context, and this context also means that it is kind of produced socially and politically, and it is kind of making of lots of processes. So when we talk about India as sociologists, social anthropologists, as historians, or social scientists in general, we also need to kind of then invoke the idea of history and how these sources come together and produce this idea of India, produce this Indian common sense. And we perhaps also then need to look at our own enterprise, social sciences. How far have we contributed to the making of this common sense? And what I'm trying to suggest is that this common sense is itself a reality which in some sense is produced over the past 75 years or past 200 years. And it's not more than 200 years. It starts with, in some sense, the white man's engagements with this place called India, or they called India, and then it kind of travels. And I'm trying to kind of look at Srinivas anthropology by locating Srinivas in this historical context. All of us know about Srinivas, and those who don't know, just kind of, this is also something that I've worked out through reading this book, that he sees himself and he identifies himself, introduces himself as a high-status Tamil Brahmin. And again, when we read the book, he tells us that all Brahmins are not high status. There are Brahmins who are like Dalits. So he is a high-status Brahmin, and his family moved from Tamil Nadu to Mysore region. I think his James Manner was telling me today that somebody, I think 3 or 4 generations back, joined the Mysore king whatever office, and then they also bought some land, or they were given some land as titles, and they, in some sense, also had a rural identification. And this village was located in Mysore region, or Mysore district as it is called. So, in his understanding, a Brahmin in 1940s or 1950s is high status only if they have agricultural land. If you don't have agricultural land, then you don't become high status Brahmin. And this again tells us some story about South India and its agrarian systems, which is very, very critical, and how agrarian structure was also actually structured around the Agraharam, which was the locality where Brahmins lived. And this is something that comes out much more clearly in Andre Bete's work, and this village is slightly different. I'll come to it. So he is somebody who has kind of done his studies here. This is my next slide. His academic background is that he was a student of sociology in Bombay University, and he completes his PhD with G.S. Ghurye in 1944. And this was the first department of sociology in India, which was called Department of Sociology, not Anthropology. And G.S. Ghurye is considered as the founder of Indian sociology. People like A.R. Desai and many others who became the kind of founder of Indian sociology were his students. And after that, he comes to Oxford, does another PhD, or it was called DPhil at that time, starts with Redcliffe Brown, completes with Evans Pritchard, and then Redcliffe Brown encourages him to also study caste. His PhD work was on religion among Kurds in Karnataka. And then there is this discussion that he has, pending this discussion with Redcliffe Brown, and he also realizes that anthropology has this interesting method of doing ethnography, right? Sociology in India was not particularly ethnographic. Anthropologists used to do, and he is impressed with functionalism, and he kind of, thinks that that is something that he should do. So Rampura, the book, which I've also showed picture of, the second edition of that book, it was, in some sense, his postdoctoral work. It doesn't use the word postdoctoral. So he's offered university lectureship in sociology. I was talking to David Gellner that why was it called sociology? Because he's in anthropology department. His training is now in anthropology. That's a question David has to still answer me, and I hope he will try to find answer when he goes back to Oxford. But why was it called sociology? But there is interesting connection that and this again becomes also a kind of living question, why in case of India, sociology and anthropology are spoken in one voice, but he does not choose to call the department he sets up in Baroda as Department of Anthropology, or the department he sets up in Delhi. There is already perhaps a Department of Anthropology in Delhi, which also teaches physical anthropology. Instead of saying that it is Department of Social Anthropology, that's what Delhi University Department of Sociology has been doing, but he calls it Department of Sociology. And then he moves to Bangalore, where he sets up a unit in Isaac and works with M.S. Rao, and that also is Department of a unit called Sociology. So, and I think this is something which is critical. I'm going back to the previous slide, that when he goes to do his field work, motivated by Redcliffe Brown, he obviously has to kind of get accepted in the village, and he chooses, I'll come to this point a little later. So it was not something that he's, again, this is a point which becomes a big issue in anthropology much later, but in India, anthropologists particularly, and also sociologists, were already talking about this insider and outsider. So are you an insider? Anthropology used to be a discipline of the white man, and they went and studied other cultures, but Srinivas in some sense encounters that question, and he writes about it, insiders and outsider. Who is he? Is he an insider or an outsider? He's a Brahmin from India. He goes to his village that is very similar to his own village. So these are questions that become a much critical central question in anthropology later, but he's also dealing with it in a very straightforward manner. He doesn't kind of become a postmodernist in the process, but these are questions that he's struggling with. So he's an outsider because he's also a secular Brahmin. He's secular in single quotes. He's progressive because he's educated, and he's being progressive, being modern is something that is kind of the way he identifies himself. But he's not prejudiced against traditional way of life. And that is something he also lived. I mean, again, Sir James Menon was telling, who was also a student, that he used to very proudly wear his dhoti when he was living in Bangalore. So, and again, he's multilingual. At home they speak Tamil, but he grew up knowing Kannada. And so in the village he speaks Kannada, and the villagers accept him as their own. So when he's taking up this study, again, going back to the idea of self and the other, he is at some level very self-consciously saying that I'm going to go to this village and work there, not because because Radcliffe Brown has told him to study caste, he's also going there to study or explore himself. So this idea of my study would enable me to better understand my personal, cultural and social roots. And this is again something that appears quite frequently in Indian social sciences. But he's also, it's 1948 when he goes there first time, Gandhi has just been assassinated. So it's a nation, new nation, the point that Kiran was trying to make earlier. So he is also located as a citizen of India. He's not seeing himself as an anthropologist only. He's not an outsider, but he's also seeing himself as an anthropologist. And he says that the extant studies that we're here talking about, economic surveys, do not give an idea of the day-to-day social relations between members of diverse castes living in a small community that could only be done through the intensive field study of a multi-caste village or town by a trained social anthropologist. And he says that this would enable the economists to develop a better understanding of the reality they are planning to work on in order to change. And he is also obviously very aware of the fact that India is generally understood both in the Western academy as well as within India through the textual sources. And this is again something that Radcliffe Brown perhaps was talking to him, that whatever we know about India is from ideological writings, orientalist writings, and these are basically classical texts which have been written by Brahmins. And he immediately recognizes this point because he belongs to that habitus. So he says that, historical and material, literary material had resulted in a view of the caste system that was at variance with that derived, for instance, from folk literature. So in the folk literature, in Indian languages, you have references to Brahmins where Brahmins are made fun of, and they are talked about as greedy, as people who are not really, all that honorable. So he says that, in order to do that, you need to kind of move from book to the field. And there's a point that I will come back to later in little detail. So there are two categories that he is working with. One is the category of caste, and second is the category of village or spatiality. Now the village is at some level a very concrete place, but at another level it is also a construct. Village is not something that is just out there. And beyond village, there is also a notion of spatiality. And India is reduced to a specific kind of spatial formation, and that is land of villages. So the idea of studying village is not study a village in Mysore district of South India. The idea of studying village is to study India. So this is again a notion which in some sense is popularized or advocated by the colonial rulers. And we all know how McCarthy talked about India as land of villages, and how Bernard Cohn talks about that this notion of India being a land of villages which not change, which never progress, which are unlikely to have any history of their own, was to convince the natives here in Britain that they are there to help Indians progress. They are there to help Indians move out of this strange equilibrium. And this is again reference to it can also be found in writings of people like Hegel. She was talking about the whole Orientalist literature on India talks about the stagnation of Indian society. Since ancient time, India has been stable, unchanging, stuck in time, and that is because of caste system. But village is also not very different from that. The specialities are at some level, they are also exclusionary. So when Srinivas goes to this village, he goes through Mysore. He's talking about a Mysore village. Mysore is not a colonial city. Mysore is at least 400 or 500 years old when he's thinking of doing this study, and Mysore has always been a city. And in Karnataka, you have cities which are much more ancient. So it doesn't even strike them that when they are studying the village, they also need to also recognize the fact that caste exists in the city. And caste is as much an urban reality. And I think this is where, apart from Orientalist or colonial imaginations of India, there's also functionalist evolutionism, which is embedded in his imagination of what he should be doing. And there again, though the idea of modernization or modernization theory is just kind of being articulated, but he already has this notion of binary imaginations of the social, that you have pre-modern community and modern collective, and that modern collective is urban and the pre-modern collective is communitarian, and that communitarian is the village in case of India. So you have tribes in Africa, but you have villages in India, and the binary, the other opposite of village is city, and city is obviously about progress, about modernity, about individual agentiality. But village is also a site of backwardness, because village is where India's lack of development lies, and that needs to be broken. So he goes with all those notions, and these notions are obviously drawn from, as I said earlier, British colonial imagination, or also they kind of come into the way anthropology here thinks about India. So this view and category were embedded in colonial framings of India. The village was a concrete reality. So this is another, caste is also a concrete reality, but village also was like something that you can easily see. It had also been the primary site of colonial plunder. I mean, it was agriculture where the colonial rulers first started imposing taxes on. So how does this idea of village acquires a kind of status of common sense? And that's an argument that I've been making. And this happens through the nationalist acceptance of the idea of village, idea of India being a land of villages. Why do they accept it? Because they are also anxious about diversity of India or plurality of India. That how do you talk about India as a potential country? And this is something that is accepted by everyone. Gandhi obviously is the ideologue of village, and my own understanding is that Gandhi's idea of village, the way he conceptualizes, is very European. It's actually the idea of small communities that he learned from here. Gandhi's family never lived in village. Nehru never lived in village. Srinagar, Delhi, Allahabad, they were all ancient old cities. They were not like built by the British. And all of them are arguing that village is where India lived. So India was a land of villages, and if we want independence, we need to recover India, a site of authenticity for Gandhi. But Nehru is exactly saying the same things. I mean, he's talking about how village, joint family, and caste system are features of a pre-modern traditional society. And that's what India is. He's not talking about city. Even Radical Ambedkar, when he's talking about village, he's looking at village as a den of ignorance and a site of oppression, because that's where Hindu caste system is produced. This is working part of Hindu caste system. And this is despite the fact that, Ambedkar's own experience of caste discrimination comes from city. He goes to Baroda and then he kind of doesn't find a house because of his identity as Dalit. But again, in some sense, that is the consensus, that is the literature that all these middle-class Indians have read about India, which is again a colonial Western literature. So then, interestingly, Srinivas writes a chapter on, or a section of a chapter where he identifies himself as a Brahmin anthropologist. So it's very interesting the way he kind of empirically engages with it. So I argue that there are two different registers. One is the empirical register, and the other one is the conceptual register, which they don't come together very easily. So he identifies himself as a Brahmin in the village, and the villagers accept him as a Brahmin. This is something that has been talked about. So, and he was, as I said earlier, high status Brahmin. He could get a house in the village, headman's house, which had 2 or 3 rooms, and he went and stays there. He goes and stays there with a servant. So he was his well-served anthropologist, and he was treated like a distinguished guest in the village. He says that I went to every single marriage or wedding that was organized in the village, and when I went for the wedding, I was treated like a Brahmin. Even poor villagers would give him a coconut and 1 rupee or whatever is given to every Brahmin, and he was actually given before others were given. And once a local Brahmin grumbles that, why do you give him priority, and the headman shouts at him, don't you realize he's a distinguished guest? So, but he also very consciously, and this is something that he says more than once, that he identifies himself with the village of touchable Hindus. And this is something that I come back to later. And he tells us about how the place where he is living, also becomes a site where people come and meet him. So it's a kind of typical village, and this idea of typical village is also very interesting because they're all looking for a typical village. What do you mean by a typical village? And this is something that's very, very central to my argument. It is typical because it's away from the city, 33 kilometers from Mysore. It is medium-sized. Its population is 1519, and I looked at the census. It was, I think, 1523. 1951 maybe or earlier. So there's one figure, but the book, he cites 1519, doesn't tell us about the number of households. It's a multi-caste village. That's what he wanted, typical 19 caste groups. It also has Muslim households, and he doesn't talk about them. Centrality of agriculture was very critical for him because that's what makes village typical, that village is, in some sense, the coupling of agrarian with the rural is very central, and I've talked about the problem with this coupling elsewhere in my work. And so his main focus is on Vukaligas, who are the local agrarian dominant caste. They're spelt as Ukaligas in the book. And this is a village which is not so progressive. It is not quote-unquote backward. And it's also not a typical village in the sense that it is not very old. It had to be resettled in 1874. Therefore, it doesn't have an Agraharam. Brahmins have left. Only 2 Brahmin families are left in the village. Perhaps the most interesting part of the book, and very strangely, Marxist scholars have not read this book. And those who did agrarian studies in 1970s, believe me, this is the best political economy book on agrarian structure of India produced by a social scientist until very recently. Believe me, I mean, I'm not saying I'm not a fan of M. Srinivas or anything, but I've done agrarian studies for a long time. Nobody told me also to read this carefully because he's talking about agrarian social structure in 1940s. And I mean, 48 he did his fieldwork. He writes it later. But the kind of description it has of agrarian class structure, I'm underlining the word class, is very rich. Is much better than any Marxist class analysis. And Marxist class analysis of 1970 was also actually very Brahminical, very, very book-centric. You know, all the mode of production debaters, they didn't really go to villages, all of them. Some of them did, but many of them were just kind of reading Karl Marx and reading Russian literature and Chinese literature and then trying to comment on what kind of mode of production Indian agriculture has. Many others I've heard them speak, but I think he deals with question of caste and class simultaneously and very nicely, very, very competently. So he talks about the dominance of dominant caste and there was general preoccupation with agriculture. Most villagers were either wholly or partly dependent upon agriculture or partly. So this is very critical that there are other enterprises in the village, and I've argued in my paper that there were lots of actually non-agriculturists as well, which is not mapped separately by him, and that is kind of because of the hangover of those times that village means agriculture and everyone has to be dependent on agriculture directly or indirectly, or servicing castes are seen as dependent directly on agriculture. But there are obviously landowners, tenants, sharecroppers, laborers, servants. But village also has priests, village also has barbers, village also has people who have very little or nothing to do with agriculture, and their number is not insignificant, right? And there are servants who are actually working on a salary, either in the village or outside. So you already have kind of, offices also coming to the village. So land is obviously the most valued asset. This is not surprising. And the prestige is related to land. And the farmers were intelligent shrewd. See, the word that is used in 1940s, 1950s, up to 1970s is peasant. And Theodore Shannon talks about how peasants are different from farmers, or farmers are different from peasants. And Daniel Thorner introduces this idea of gentleman farmer when he's talking about development of capitalism in Indian agriculture. But Srinivas, in some sense, is using these two words interchangeably. And I think this is not done without any understanding of the reality. So he's talking about peasant as a generic category, but the moment he talks about individuals, he finds them actually enterprising farmers. They're not peasants. They were intelligent, and he uses the word intelligent. That also means they were agential, right? And they're shrewd. They are sensitive to new opportunities, but they also knew that their economy did not permit them to take slightest risk. The price of failure was starvation, and this is again something that he talks about. But then there are also what I would call as the capitalist bourgeois farmers. So patent-clad structure is obviously very pronounced at that time. Interestingly, nowhere in the book the word jajmani appears. He is not using the word jajmani. He uses the English word patent-client relations, and patent-client relations are not simply caste dependencies. Patent-client relations are also class dependencies, and this is very, very critical. And I was so fascinated by his discussion of attached labor system. I worked on attached labor in 1980s, and before me there was this work of Sheila Bhalla, which was published in 1971. She worked in 1960s in Haryana, and where she's talking about how the old kind of tenant sharecroppers who were called as series, they were being kind of shifted to the new arrangement of being knockers. And knocker is somebody who works with you for a year for a fixed wage. A siri or saji is like a partner tenant whom you give land, but he's also loyal to you as a servant. Unlike a tenant who is actually working on agricultural land, a siri was tied, bonded laborer as they were called. Now, jitas are already formalized. Jitas are bonded labor, not bonded laborers. They are annual servants. They work with one farmer all the year, but their contract is signed. It's kind of formalized in 1948, something that we or economists begin to talk about in 1970s. It is already there, and he identifies them as being different from the earlier kind of arrangement of bonded labor. Likewise, the person, headman, who is the biggest landowner, he is not an absentee landlord. He's not a semi-feudal landlord. He's very much entrepreneurial, capitalist, and he has ability to think beyond agriculture. The headman was a superb organization. He did not fuss or complain. He drove himself hard, and he thought others working for him should also do the same. The headman had realized that the ultimate source of his prosperity was his land, and he and his sons worked ceaselessly at supervision of its cultivation. And he was also a man of unusual foresight. He told me as far back as in 1948 that he was not interested in adding an acre of land to his estate. He had decided to invest his savings in commerce and industry. So he's a classical kind of entrepreneur. Headman also has money lending business, by the way. But he's not a money lender in the village. He has a money lending business where he lends money in the neighboring village. So he realizes that he doesn't want to confuse it with dependency relationships where people will not return. And he has a loyal Muslim servant who oversees his money lending business. So it's a pure business for interest. It's not usurious money lending. And there's another very interesting discussion in his writing, which again came very surprisingly to, very, very enlightening for me, that in 1940s also farmers were speaking exactly the same language that they were speaking in 2020-21. That, the relationship between village and the city, or Sharad Joshi coined the idea of Bharat versus India. So unlike the functionalist anthropologists, villagers did not see the city through a modernization progress perspective. And he spoke to the villagers. For them, it was a relational structure of power, very similar to what Sharad Joshi describes as Bharat versus India. City was a richer and better place to live because it thrived on the value extracted from them through various means. And these are the citations. Agriculturists were convinced that no work was as important as agriculture. And this is precisely what the farmers were saying in 2021, that, we are annadatas. The cities with their wide, tarred roads, their big buildings, hospitals, schools, colleges, and other amenities had fattened themselves on the labor of the poor agriculturists. It's a much longer statement which I've quoted in the paper. Another very interesting thing that I want to highlight here is the conceptualization that I started working on it, and some other people are also working on it, that caste is a material process. I've argued in one of the paper that came out last year on materiality of, it was called On the Futures of Caste, and I have a section on what I call as the materiality of caste. And everyone obviously talks about caste as a ritual hierarchy, and Srinivas is very clearly and sharply identifying these material processes which actually produce hierarchies of caste. And local power, to an extent, even social status, were as much, if not more, determined by patterns of land ownership than the ritual hierarchy of caste. And as I would like to put it, land played a kind of mediating role between ritual status and social status. These are two different things in the village. You may have ritual status, but you may still not be able to translate that ritual status into social status if you don't own land. And in his word, complexity of the hierarchical system of caste at the grassroots level, he writes, was compounded by its meshing in with another hierarchical system based on possession of differential rights in land. There was a two-way relationship between land ownership and caste rank. Traditionally, ownership of land conferred respectability and prestige, and this was translated into caste rank in course of time. And counterwise, high ritual rank, unaccompanied by land ownership, produced anomalous situation. Right? If you are a Brahmin and you don't own land, you're not high status person in the village, so status hierarchy. So land was obviously more critical. Even his process of sanskritization is a material process. He's not talking about sanskritization as a kind of ritual process only. And it was only after they had acquired land that there was a possibility of a person being able to sanskritize. A Brahmin or Lingayat had to behave differently towards, the biggest landowner from the peasant caste commanded the respect of everyone in the village. So the high status did not belong to Brahmins. Brahmins and Lingayats who were priests, they had to treat them differentially. So among the non-Brahmin caste, the acquisition of land was sooner or later followed by sanskritization, or nowadays also westernization of the style of life, meant that an attempt was being made to translate wealth and prestige into caste rank. The view that the traditional Indian society provides an instance of a closed system of social stratification is indeed neat, though not true. I mean, this whole idea about closed versus open system of stratification has been popular. Many of my colleagues teach in the classroom, caste is a closed system of stratification, class is an open system of stratification, and Srinivas is saying that this is kind of, that's why I'm saying that this idea of caste and overlapping with class is very, very crucial. So I can go on for another 25 minutes?
About 15 minutes.
You told me 1 hour.
1 hour, okay, fine.
Okay, I'll try to do it in 20 minutes, yeah. Also, he kind of rejects the idea of varna. He says varna has nothing to do with caste. Caste is jati. Jati is a local institution. Varna is a kind of textual reference which has actually nothing to do with caste on ground. And then he also goes on to conceptualize caste, not very different from the way Louis Dumont would do, and he talks about interdependence and separation, where I think he forgets materiality part, which he underlines earlier. Interdependence is because occupational interdependence and who you should sit and who you should not sit. Separation is again coming back to ritual status. The idea of hierarchy derived from Varna model of 5-layered India-wide caste are misleading in understanding the caste system as it operates at the village level and also at the regional level. And by implication, empirically, we could make sense of caste only in a regional context. So this is the argument that I've been making in my work, and I find Srinivas is making exactly the same argument like 50 years before I did, that caste can be understood only at the regional level, and caste is a material process. If you separate it from materiality, you can't engage with the realities of caste in the contemporary. So he also has a chapter on family and household, where his argument is, again, the very moral or fragile moral order of caste, and household as an institution is very, very strong. Everyone is married. People ask him, are you married or not? He says, no. How come you are not married? Somebody asks him, is there something wrong with you that you are not married and you are grown up? Another person brings a match for him. So he has to kind of justify. But at the same time, it's a very interesting statement. There's a long discussion about sexual morality in the village. Many villagers calmly express the view that only one village elder was faithful to his wife. I thought they were probably pulling my leg, but I later discovered that they were serious. I heard it on several occasions and from the most unlikely persons. and they did not seem to think that they were giving expression to anything out of the ordinary. And then he goes on to talk about how sexual urge was seen as kind of a natural, like food, hunger, and stuff like that. Okay, now finally 15 minutes, my take on the Rampura. So as I said earlier, there is an empirical village which is located in a regional context, which has its own reality, and Srinivas tries to make sense of it. And there's a conceptual frame where, as I said in the beginning, that you're talking about caste as a textual reality, but you're not realizing the idea of village is also a textual reality. It's also a construct, it's also a colonial construct, which had certain kind of political purpose. So the idea of village being India in microcosm at some level obviously brackets out urban from the Indian realities. City life has been in India as old as anywhere else. From ancient times, you have cities in India. Even Harappa and Mohenjo-daro had urban centers, and city and village have always been together. This is again something that I've been talking about in my work, that cities emerge along with villages, and they are kind of part of the one given social structure, but they separate village as something to study Indian society as if it has nothing to do with the city. So, and Andre Bete writes this, the village was not merely a place, it had a design that reflected the basic values of Indian civilization. Caste represented a unique form of social stratification, and millions of human beings had ordered their lives according to it for over 2 millennia. Study of a multi-caste village appealed to me for several reasons, including, of course, the purely scientific one of adding to existing knowledge about the working of a uniquely hierarchical society which was on the threshold of far-reaching changes. Now see, look at this statement. It completely forgets what all he has observed in the village, and it goes back to the earlier orientalist view of India, that caste is something which has been around for ages, and it has shaped life in India for millions of 2 millennia at least. So he's kind of, on the one hand, it's not reconciling materiality argument with the regional materiality and regionality with ideology and singularity. On the other hand, he is also falling back into this singular view of India, which in some sense is very orientalist and nationalist kind of claim it. And then there is this singularity that becomes the main narrative around which the book is woven. The reality of book is something else, the framework of book is something else. So village becomes a site for exploring India's tradition. The idea of tradition is again a conceptual construct which has kind of come from functionalist anthropology, which at some level uncritically accepts colonial and orientalist view of India's past, and then a shift back from the field to the framing, an exceptionalist view of Indian tradition. India is uniquely hierarchical society. Means India is uniquely hierarchical society everywhere, all the time. Village or city, Karnataka or Punjab, Himachal or Jammu Kashmir, Bengal or Gujarat. So everywhere it is one India. So, and this singularity becomes very, very central to idea of village for Srinivas. Along with secularity, there is also the idea of Hinduness. So Indian village is equal to what I would call as the Hindu village. He doesn't use the word Hindu village, but that's what he's talking about if you read his chapter on Hinduism, on religion. So it's something which he also goes on to, this is again my derivation from his book, that there is a kind of way in which he is looking at the village in terms of, that's why reading Rampura in the present context, so he identifies the core of village as the Hindu touchable castes. And that's what he's interested in. Not that he could not have explored Harijans. He uses the word Harijan, not untouchables, throughout the book. But Harijan is a singular category. Muslim was his neighbor. And Muslim was the loyal servant of the person he was living with, headman. He doesn't talk to a Muslim about their life. So there is a core of the village which is touchable Hindu, and they are the ones who shape social and economic landscape of India, and they were the village empirically for him, right? Harijan is on the periphery. They live there, they work there, but they are not part of the village. They are on the periphery, literally. They live away from the village, but they are also conceptually not relevant for his understanding or the requirement that he has for understanding of the village. They are not required to be understood. So again, though he rejects the idea of Varna, but when it comes to Harijans, he lumps them together. Now, in Karnataka state, there are 101 communities, caste communities that are listed as scheduled caste. The village would definitely have at least 5 to 10 communities which are untouchables, which are so-called Harijans or Dalits, and he doesn't really ask them, he doesn't talk about it. He occasionally, at one place, he says that, local Harijans, because they have become conscious of their rights, they don't want to do scavenging work. And this is 1948. So the villagers hire a Dalit or Harijan from another village who does the scavenging work in the village. One person wouldn't have been able to do scavenging work for the entire village. There would be many other caste groups who were also quote-unquote Harijans, but this is... And third is the Muslim. And this is again very critical for the present context. And he very clearly says that Muslim is outsider. Muslim doesn't belong to the village. And we are talking about Mysore, which has had very strong Muslim history with Tipu Sultan as a legendary king. Even today, they talk about it, but the Muslim is an outsider. And I'm not saying it myself. Harijan had their distinct religious life, their own temples and their own deities mentioned, but again the word Harijan, as if they had only one deity. All jatis of untouchables will have different deities. There would be, I think, if there are 5 different jatis, 5 different deities would be there, or even more than 5. And of course, caste Hindus did not worship a deity associated with Harijans exclusively. So there is a Harijan religious life which is autonomous of the village, but it is not required for him to study the Indian village. So as a peripheral native of the village, Dalit had the potential and even aspiration to become Hindu. The path available to them was through the process of sanskritization, and he's kind of very blunt on this. Of the few Harijans whom I came to know reasonably well, Pijja, who was actually an attached laborer, was the most sanskritized, and he expressed the idea of popular Hinduism better than many high caste men. Kullaiya, the Harijan headman, who was respected for his piety, it is not unlikely that these men were the vanguards of a more thoroughly sanskritized culture for their caste as a whole. So he is waiting them to become Hindus, become part of Hinduism before he studies them. And he is very blunt about it, that I'm not interested in Harijans. Muslim, the outsider, is again very explicitly the outsider. While relations between individual Muslim clients and their Hindu patrons were one of trust, the relations between Hindus and Muslims as a distinct group were marked occasionally by suspicion. The more politically conscious villagers occasionally expressed their suspicion about the loyalty to India of some of the immigrants. The word used, immigrant, is very, very scary, right? Ghuspaitiya, right? So they come from outside, they're not from the village. And he again kind of, he knows Karim is the most loyal servant of the headman. And headman depends on Karim. Karim is the one who runs his money lending business, and when headman is to be taken to the hospital, there's no one left in the village. It's only Karim that he trusts to sleep in his house during his absence. So it makes no reference to Muslim religiosity, not even to the existence of a mosque in the village. The only reference to Muslim is in relation to Hindus or Hindu shrines. Muslim sent votive offerings of milk and buttermilk to the Hindu deities of Madheshwara in thanks for safe carving of their cow. Likewise, even urban educated Hindus visited graves of Muslims, peers, in hope of having their wishes granted. So this is where I think reading Rampura in the present context becomes critical, and this is where the idea of common sense that I started with, and that is the singular imagination, the singular imaginary, that India is one country and that one country has to, in some sense, be kind of conceptualized in a particular manner. And this is where what I call as the textbook view of India. What we teach today, if you look at any textbook of India, whether it is economics or it is sociology or history. And for example, in JNU, we've had Department of History, where very respectable historians have written books on ancient Indian history. So this methodological nationalism is taken for granted, as if there was something called ancient India. Right? Ancient India is a construct of the contemporary instead of talking about ancient times. So there is, the titles of the books are ancient India. So there is a kind of singularity that then becomes the normative and the normal in textbook understanding of India. So the shift from book to the field does not go very far in the absence of a political engagement with the colonial framings of India and the uses it has had for the nationalists. The slogan unity in diversity, for example, emphasizes unity and frames diversity only as a facade, and this is something that has become very easy to understand today. The idea of tolerant Hindu is also a possible warning that they can become intolerant. Why should you call tolerant? Why should anyone be tolerant, right? So that is only the opposite that is being conveyed in the process. However, I think this is very, very critical, and this is what I think is you were talking about earlier that how ethnography has a life of its own. And that life of ethnography is more than the imagination of the anthropologists. So he allows, in some sense, his field to speak for itself. And what I was saying earlier, I could read Srinivas as a scholar of political economy. And it's very useful to read Srinivas as a scholar of political economy. So, and his village is certainly not a traditional place. The way he tells us about a village, it could be a small town in Ireland. It could be a small city in 21st century, perhaps in any other developed country. Where life is very complicated. There's not one single story. There are many stories within the village and the stories that he's not exploring. And they are very clearly there in the book. So there is a kind of complicated reality of the village which comes out very clearly. Many of his respondents had strong individualized personalities. So if it is tradition, then there should be no individualized personality. And the way he talks about headman is an enterprising capitalist bourgeois farmer of the 21st century. He is looking for, and he says that how he is able to extract maximum from his tenants. And he gets best tenants because he's the headman. So the only thing that he's interested is accumulation. He raises, makes saving, and then those are invested in rice mill, in urban investments. He buys urban land, the headman, and then he supports his competitor, who is the leader of another faction, Nadu Gowda, to help him set up a rice mill. Even though they compete politically, on class basis, they align with each other. He's not using, this is my language. So they are agential, they are individualized. Sexuality is also very individualized. It's also very contested. There are all kinds of these women complaining that I will go and complain against this person, and there are many other kind of stories. So likewise, if you look at agrarian studies, the idea of green revolution, which was not yet coined, and this village already has canal. There is a canal irrigation, there is road going by, and we have this notion of village becoming developed only in the 1970s, and all our life, even I have written, how there was this, Daniel Thorner gave us this concept of built-in depressor, and Professor John Harris has also written 2 articles on does depressor still work. It wasn't working in 1948. Agriculture was not, they had no built-in depressor. This was a very enterprising agriculture. It had everything of a capitalist kind of farming system. And, we have a narrative which again is coming to us from somewhere else, which visualizes green revolution as the moment of sudden agricultural progress. And it also is a good point to criticize green revolution. Productivity is rising. People are already moving to rice in Rampura in 1948. Out of fashion, out of profit urge, cropping patterns are changing. So likewise, it's also questioning the idea of semi-feudal and all those categories that Marxists were very fond of using without looking at the empirics. The empirics were saying something else. The narratives that were being constructed by Marxist class analysis were actually denying the realities that existed in rural India at that time. So likewise, as I said earlier, ethnographic account of caste are very different from the idea of Hindu caste system. So this idea of Hindu caste system is has become a textbook idea across different sections, including Dalit movement, accepts that idea that there is a one pan-Indian Hindu caste system, and it also accepts exceptional realities, India's exceptionalism, that this is unique to India. While actually when you go look at India closely, you can compare it with other societies which have status hierarchies, and all societies have status hierarchies, and those status hierarchies are contextual. Karnataka's status hierarchies are different from status hierarchies of Punjab. Punjab is different from neighboring Himachal Pradesh. I've done empirical work on both these states and Haryana. So, but there is no singular hierarchy, and this is again something that I said. So relationship between the village and the city is still perceived by farmers in the same way which I had said. It's a relationship which can be best understood through power, extraction, caste. Even in this village, they are saying that, urban is Brahmin and we are Vogaligas, and that's why we don't have entry into urban. But Srinivas is saying that Brahmins got educated first, agrarian caste will follow, that they have become urban, gradually Vogaligas will also get educated and then they'll also move to urban, the classical modernization theory. So the relationship between the village and the city is still perceived by farmers in the same way. So ethnographic accounts of field studies in general have the possibilities of transcending the politics of their moment or that of their author. They can lay the groundwork for critical social sciences, however, only when we also critically reflect on the available categories and language and examine their value politically. Meanwhile, the village of Kudagahalli is the name of village that he calls Rampura. Why Rampura? Rampura is what makes it Indian. Rampura makes it Hindu. Ram is, after all, Hindu god. Real name is Kudagahalli, which would not be comprehensible to a North Indian, to a Western audience. Shows no sign of disappearing, which was expected by functionalist modernization, or becoming an urban center. Even though many villagers would have moved to the city, its population has nearly doubled over the past 3 quarters. A piece of Times of India puts it at 5,000, but actually it's around 2,800 in 2011 census. India had more villages in 2011 than it had in 1901, right, 110 years before. So rural is not anyway disappearing. Even rural settlements are not disappearing. Even when many villages become urban, what are they called, urban census towns, the number of villages, the new villages are coming up still. So village is a reality which needs to be understood very differently. So there are new villages. There are villages which are kind of processes. So rural landscape has indeed been changing, and it has always been changing, like caste has always been changing. However, there is no single story of change. There are many different kinds of rural settlement. Himachal Pradesh, you won't find more than 25, 30, 50 households making a village. In Bihar, in Madhubani, one village had like 30,000 population. So these are very different kinds of rural settlements, and Bernard Cohen had identified 3 or 4 different kinds of classifications of rural. So Kotagahalli is a good example. Farming in Rampura tends to erase its history and identity. Framing it as Rampura also tends to erase its history and identity. And these are 2 images that I found. The fields in Rampura and the village Rampura, the street that is going into the village, and it still is village. I have not visited Rampura, and now that I have started thinking about it, next time get an opportunity, I would visit Rampura. Thank you very much for listening to me. Less than 1 hour.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Professor Jodka. And this lecture has been supported ever since its inception by the Royal Anthropological Institute. And so please may I ask the director, Dr. David Shanklin, to come and say a little bit of thanks. And before we move to a wine reception.
Well, I think I can speak for all of us when I say what an absolutely marvellous lecture that was. It's really a tour de force which only a very good lecture can really stimulate the audience to go off in multiple directions. And that's clearly what's happening tonight. Certainly it's a very great privilege for our institute to be able to support this lecture. Not only, of course, is King's one of the great world centres of intellectual activity. India itself has had a profoundly important place in all of our intellectual education, and simply as an extraordinarily significant and important country in today's global context, we all must take it with the utmost seriousness, and it behoves us all to learn as much about it as we can. Just to give a tiny example where I found it so extraordinarily stimulating in one respect is, absolutely, my understanding as well is that Wycliffe Brown defined his understanding of anthropology as comparative sociology. So I can see him taking his young students to one side and saying, let's call your lectureship one in sociology, shall we? Because he was fighting these internal battles all the time in Oxford to claim this his own discipline. But his own chair was in social anthropology, supported by all sorts of sociology. Well, now it is as well, but it was then as well.
Okay.
But not only that, absolutely fascinating. Exactly the same time, Paul Stirling left Oxford to go and do fieldwork in Turkey, in a Turkish village. And exactly as you described here, he also felt that the fine empirical work that he was doing was an absolute refutation of Marxism. He said Marxism just doesn't work in the local context. But not only that, he also was looking for an absolutely typical village. And then not only that, he taught a whole bunch of students that went on to try and use their findings to contribute to some kind of national endeavour. And the difference is, though, of course, that in one area we see Hinduism as becoming gradually dominant. But then in Turkey what happens is some conception of Islamic Turkishness becomes also the absolute dominant paradigm. And then you begin to see some contrast. For in Turkey, for example, the local intellectuals actually try to hold on to the idea of Islam as being a very, very multifaceted approach to religious life, where the new internationalist waves of Islam tend to simplify it. And so in a way you can say that the anthropologists kind of half created the battle and half lost the battle. But you see, that's only me sitting in my little corner here with my own thoughts. I'm sure that everybody in the audience would have had equally their own ideas, and we'll just have to try and catch up with you over a drink later. But thank you very much indeed.